The snow had been falling since before first light, and by the time the people of Harlan's Crossing gathered at the mercantile steps for the weekly post distribution, it lay 4 inches deep on the board sidewalk, and nobody had bothered to sweep it. Clara Voss stood at the back of the small crowd with her chin level, in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, holding a letter she had already read twice and would not read again. The letter was from a man named Gerald Pratt, who ran the land office 2 towns east, and it said in plain legal language that the 40 acres her late husband Elias had mortgaged the winter before his death were now formally recalled, the grace period having elapsed, and that she had 30 days to vacate the cabin and outbuildings situated thereon. The letter was dated 3 weeks prior. She had 7 days. She was 34 years old. She had come to Harlan's Crossing as a bride at 19, buried a husband at 32, and had spent the 2 years between that burial and this morning doing the work of 2 people on land that had never been generous. She was not a woman given to public displays of anything, but her hands, she noticed, had gone very still around the letter, the way hands do when the body understands something the mind is still catching up to. Doris Hale was standing close enough to read over her shoulder, which Clara knew because Doris Hale was always standing close enough to read over someone's shoulder. "Well," Doris said, to no one and everyone, with the particular brightness of a woman delivering concern she had prepared at home. "I suppose that explains the state of the Voss fence line this past season." The crowd did not respond loudly, but it shifted, the way a crowd does when it has heard something it will store up for later. Clara folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She said nothing to Doris Hale because there was nothing to say to Doris Hale, and she turned to go. She did not see, because she was not looking for it, that a man at the far edge of the crowd had watched the whole exchange from under the brim of a dark hat. His name was Thomas Greer. He was 38 years old, a carpenter and sometime farrier who owned 160 acres 3 miles north of town along the Sutter Creek drainage, and he had been in Harlan's Crossing that morning to collect a shipment of milled pine he had been waiting on for 6 weeks. He watched Clara Voss put the letter in her pocket and walk back through the snow with her spine straight and her pace measured, and he stood there for a moment after she had gone, the way a man stands when he has just seen something that requires him to think. By the second autumn, people in Harlan's Crossing would stop referring to the Greer place as that sad house on the creek. Clara would not know that yet. She did not know much of anything that morning, except that she had 7 days and nowhere particular to go. She had been born in a church-run home in Wichita, the daughter of no one who had stayed long enough to be named on a document. She had learned to cook in that home's kitchen at the age of 8, to sew at 9, to keep accounts at 11, because the woman who ran the home was practical about what girls would need. She had married Elias Voss at 19 because he was kind and had land and had asked her honestly, and she had loved him in the durable way of people who have not had much and know the value of what they are given. She had not fallen apart when he died. She had planted the kitchen garden the following spring and kept the fence line as long as she was able and paid what she could on the mortgage until she could not. And she had not asked anyone for anything, which was not stubbornness, so much as a habit so old she could not locate where it had started. She was halfway to the livery to collect her horse when she heard boots on the snow behind her, unhurried and even. "Mrs. Voss." She turned. Thomas Greer stopped a respectful distance away, hat in hand, despite the cold, the snow collecting on his shoulders in a way he did not appear to notice. "Mr. Greer, I heard what was said back there," he said. "Not my business to have heard it, but I did." "It's a small town," she said. He nodded once. "I've got 4 children, and no one running my house since March. My eldest is 13, and she's been doing what she can, but she's 13. He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I need hands. You need a home." I thought it was worth saying out loud. Clara looked at him for a moment. The wind moved between them and took some snow off the mercantile roof and scattered it. "What would the arrangement be?" she said. "Room and board and a fair wage. You'd have the small room off the kitchen. The work is the house and the children, cooking and keeping. Nothing beyond that. He said it plainly, the way you state the terms of a thing you want to be clear about. If it doesn't suit after a month, you're free to go, and I'll give you 2 months' wage to help you along." She looked at him a moment longer. He did not look away, and he did not add anything, which she noted. "All right," she said. "I'll come with the wagon Thursday morning," he said. "That give you enough time." "It will." He put his hat back on and nodded and walked back toward the freight office, and Clara stood in the snow for another moment before she turned and continued to the livery. She had 5 days to pack what was hers and leave what was not, and she was already sorting the list in her mind before she reached the door. She arrived at the Greer place on a Thursday morning with a single trunk, a sewing basket with a broken hinge she had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and a small tin recipe box that had belonged to the woman who ran the Wichita home and had been given to Clara the morning she left at 18. The tin was dented and the latch did not close flush, but it held every recipe she knew, and a few she was still working out, written in 2 different hands on index cards gone soft with handling. She set it on the kitchen shelf the first morning without thinking about it, the way you set down something that has always been yours. The Greer house was a good-sized log and timber structure, 2 stories, with a long porch facing the creek and a kitchen that was large and cold, and had not been properly organized in some time. It was not dirty exactly, but it had the particular disorder of a house run by someone doing their best under difficult conditions, which was to say that Thomas Greer's eldest, Ruth, had been doing her best under difficult conditions since March. Ruth was 13 and had her father's dark eyes and a manner that was watchful and not unfriendly, but not friendly either. She met Clara at the door and showed her the kitchen and the larder and the sleeping arrangements with the efficiency of someone conducting an inspection they had not asked for. She did not say anything unkind. She also did not say anything warm. The other 3 children were Henry, who was 10 and gap-toothed, and had already decided to like Clara on the grounds that she had arrived with a trunk that might contain interesting things, and the twins, Bess and Will, who were 6 and who attached themselves to Clara's coat hem within the first hour with the straightforward confidence of children who have been without a steady woman's presence, long enough to be hungry for one. Thomas Greer showed her the house and the outbuildings and the woodpile and the state of the larder with the same plainness he had used in town, pointing at what needed doing and what was already in order, and what he had given up on for the winter. He did not apologize for the state of things. She did not expect him to. When he was done, he said he would be in the barn or the workshop most days until supper, and that supper at 6 would be appreciated. And she said she understood, and that was the extent of their first day's conversation. She made a potato soup that first evening from what the larder had, with dried herbs from a bunch she found hanging near the back window, and a heel of salt pork she rendered down for fat. It was plain food, but it was hot and it was seasoned, and it filled the kitchen with a smell that was different from whatever the kitchen had smelled like before. And she saw Henry close his eyes for 1 second when he sat down, the way a person does when something is better than they expected. Ruth ate her soup and said nothing. Clara did not push. The second week was the week Clara found the state of the household accounts. Thomas Greer had left them on the kitchen table without comment, a ledger and a box of receipts, and she understood this as an invitation to take them over, which she did, spending 2 evenings at the kitchen table by lamplight, going through them with the methodical patience she had learned at 8 years old in a church-run home that did not have the luxury of imprecision. She found 3 billing errors in the feed supplier's invoices and corrected them. She said nothing to Thomas about this. He came in from the workshop one evening to find her still at the table, the lamp low, the ledger open, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the organized receipts and the corrected column. And then he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had left on the back of the stove and sat down across from her without a word, and drank it while she finished the column. She did not look up. He did not speak. When she was done, she closed the ledger and said good night and went to her room, and he sat there a while longer with the empty cup. The porch step, the second one from the bottom, had a soft spot that caught and held water, and had been rotting quietly for some time. Clara had noticed it the first morning and had been careful of it since. On a Tuesday in the third week, she came out to find it repaired, the rotten board replaced with a clean piece of pine-fitted flush, and true, the nails set so there was nothing to catch a hem on. She stood on it once to feel that it held. Nothing was said about the step. She said nothing about it either. It was Ruth who thawed first, though thawed was not quite the right word for it, because Ruth did not thaw so much as she made a series of small, deliberate decisions that added up to something warmer. It started with the bread. Clara had been making the bread every other morning, a plain white loaf, and sometimes a darker one with a little molasses. And on a Wednesday in the fourth week, she came down to find Ruth already at the table with the flour out and the bowl ready, waiting without asking, and Clara came and stood beside her and showed her without being asked how to feel when the dough was right, the particular give and resistance of it, and Ruth listened with the focused attention of a girl who has decided to learn a thing and is not going to do it halfway. They made the bread together that morning, and most mornings after, and it was not discussed. It simply became what happened on bread mornings, and somewhere in the course of it, Ruth began to ask Clara things, small, practical questions at first, and then larger ones. And Clara answered them all with the same plain directness she used for everything. And the watchfulness in Ruth's eyes became something else, something that was not quite trust yet, but was oriented toward it. Henry had been won over by the potato soup and confirmed in his opinion by the discovery that Clara could sharpen a knife properly, which he reported to his father with some gravity. The twins required nothing beyond her presence and her willingness to answer the same question multiple times, which she had in abundance. Thomas Greer watched all of this from the edges of rooms and said very little about any of it, which was his way of saying a great deal. It was a Sunday in late November, the fifth week, and the cold had come down hard off the ridge 2 days before and was not lifting. Clara had made a beef stew from a piece of chuck Thomas had brought in from the cold cellar, and it had been on the stove since mid-morning, and the whole house had that particular smell of a winter kitchen working, meat and root vegetables and wood smoke and something yeasty from the bread she had set to rise near the stove. Thomas came in from the barn at midday, earlier than usual, with ice in his beard and his hands red from the cold, and he stood at the kitchen door pulling off his coat. And Will, who was 6 and had no particular filter between what he thought and what he said, looked up from the floor where he was playing and said, "Papa, it smells like when Mama was here." The kitchen went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something true has been said in it. Thomas stood with his coat half off and did not speak. Clara was at the stove with her back to the room, and she kept her back to the room. And she kept her hands on what they were doing, because the moment required someone to hold it steady, and she was the one who could. "It's the stew," she said, to the pot quietly. "Same kind of cold calls for the same kind of stew, I expect." It was not quite true, and it was not quite untrue, and it was the right thing to say, and Will accepted it with the easy faith of a 6-year-old, and went back to his playing, and Thomas finished taking off his coat and hung it on the peg and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table, and Clara heard the chair settle under him, and she heard him breathe out once, slowly, the way a man does when he has set something down that he has been carrying for a while. She served the stew, and they ate, all 6 of them, and outside the snow came down steady and quiet, and the light was the flat white light of a winter afternoon, and nobody said much of anything, but the table was full, and the stove was working, and the recipe tin on the shelf caught the lamplight, the way it always did. She did not name what she felt. She set it aside the way she set aside things she did not have time to examine. And she washed the bowls, and she put the kitchen right, and she went to her room that night and sat on the edge of her bed for a while before she lay down. Some things change the moment you look at them straight. She did not look at it straight. Not yet. Doris Hale had a particular gift for keeping information warm until it was most useful to serve it, and she had been keeping the story of Clara Voss warm since November. She served it in January on a Saturday at the dry goods counter of Whitmore's Mercantile to an audience of 3 women and the dry goods clerk, in the form of a question so well constructed it did not need to be a statement. "I only wonder," Doris said, with the careful brightness of a woman who has wondered nothing and concluded everything, "what kind of arrangement it really is. A widow alone in a widower's house, no family to speak of on either side, a man with 4 children and no chaperone. You have to wonder what people will make of it come spring." The 3 women received this with the particular silence of people who have just been given permission to wonder something they had already been wondering, and the dry goods clerk found something to do at the far end of the counter. By the following Tuesday, 3 versions of the story were circulating in Harlan's Crossing, each one slightly worse than the last, and by Wednesday they had reached Gerald Pratt at the land office 2 towns east, who had his own reasons for being interested in Clara Voss's situation. Reasons that had to do with the 40 acres he now held, and a buyer he had been negotiating with since October, who wanted the Voss cabin and the water rights attached to it, and who had been asking inconvenient questions about the prior owner. Gerald Pratt arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a Thursday afternoon, which was the same Thursday that Thomas Greer had driven into town for feed and lumber, and had left Clara at the house with the children. Pratt found her at the Mercantile, where she had come for thread and lamp oil, and he presented himself at the counter beside her, with the ease of a man who has never had to think about whether he has a right to be somewhere. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I heard you'd found a situation." "Mr. Pratt," she said. She did not look at him. She told the clerk the weight of thread she needed. "I want you to understand," he said, lowering his voice in the way of a man who wants to be overheard being discreet, "that there are questions being asked about the arrangement up at the Greer place. Questions that reflect on you. I feel it's my duty to mention it." "Your duty," she said, "as someone who knew Elias." She turned and looked at him then, fully, with the level regard of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, and has therefore never needed to. "Elias knew you, Mr. Pratt. That's not quite the same thing." She paid for her thread and her lamp oil, and she left. And Pratt stood at the counter with the particular stillness of a man who has just heard something he did not expect, and is deciding whether to be angry about it. He decided to be angry about it. The following Saturday was the first Saturday of February, and it was the day that Harlan's Crossing held its winter market in the community hall, a monthly gathering of vendors and neighbors that served the dual purpose of commerce and information exchange, and which was attended by most of the county's residents because there was not much else to do in February. Thomas had brought the family in for it, all 6 of them, because Ruth had a length of quilting cotton to sell, and Henry had been promised a peppermint stick, and the twins would not hear of being left behind. Gerald Pratt was there, and Doris Hale was there, and approximately 60 other people of Harlan's Crossing were there, and the hall was warm and loud with the particular warmth and loudness of people who have been cold and quiet for too long. It was Doris Hale who started it, because it was always Doris Hale who started it, with a comment made at carrying volume near the quilting table about the nature of certain housekeeping arrangements and what they said about the people who made them. And the comment was not directed at Clara directly, but was aimed with the precision of a woman who has had a great deal of practice. Clara was at the far end of the quilting table with Ruth, helping her lay out the cotton, and she heard it. And she went still for a moment, and her face did what she needed it to do, which was nothing. It was Thomas Greer who moved. He had been at the lumber vendor's table across the hall, and he had heard it, and he crossed the hall in the particular way of a large man who is not hurrying but is covering ground quickly. And he stopped in the center of the room where the light was good and the crowd was thickest, and he spoke in a voice that was not loud, but carried the way a voice carries when it is certain of itself. "I want to say something in front of this room," he said. "Clara Voss came to work for my family in November. She has kept my house and fed my children and put my accounts in order, and she has done it with more decency and competence than this town has shown her since she arrived in it. I am telling you this because it is true and because it should have been said sooner." The hall was quiet. 60 people held what they were doing. "I also want to say," he continued it, "that I intend to ask her to stay permanently, if she'll have me, and that what anyone in this room thinks about that arrangement is their own business and not mine." He did not look at Doris Hale when he said it. He did not look at Gerald Pratt. He looked at Clara, who was standing at the quilting table with Ruth's length of cotton in her hands, and her chin level, in the way he had first seen on the mercantile steps in December, and he held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once and walked back to the lumber table. The hall stayed quiet for another moment, and then it resumed, the way a hall resumes when it has witnessed something it will be talking about for a long time. And Doris Hale said nothing further, and Gerald Pratt found somewhere else to stand, and Ruth looked at Clara with those dark eyes that were her father's eyes, and said quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," Clara said, and then, after a moment, "Thank you for asking." Ruth nodded and began to fold the cotton, and Clara helped her fold it, and neither of them said anything else about it, but something had settled between them that had been unsettled before, and they both knew it. He did not speak to her about it that evening. The family drove home in the wagon in the cold, and the twins fell asleep against Clara's sides before they reached the creek road, and she held them steady against the wagon's movement, and Thomas drove, and Henry talked about the peppermint stick, and Ruth sat quietly with her unsold cotton because she had decided she didn't want to sell it after all, and the stars were very clear and very cold above the ridge. She put the children to bed, and she came back down to the kitchen, and she put the kettle on, because it was something to do with her hands. And she was standing at the stove when Thomas came in from checking the animals, and hung his coat and stood in the kitchen doorway, the way he sometimes did, taking the measure of the room. "I should have asked you before I said it," he said, "in the hall." "It was your hall to say it in," she said. "It was about you." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "It needed saying. You said it. I'm not sorry for it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came to the table and sat down, and she poured 2 cups from the kettle and set one in front of him, and sat across from him. And the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was low, and outside the creek was frozen, and the pines were still. "I meant what I said," he told her, "about asking you to stay." She looked at her cup. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he continued. "I know you know that by now. And I know what I'm asking is considerable, and I know you've had enough of people deciding things for you." He paused, and she heard him choose his next words carefully, the way a carpenter measures before he cuts. "I'm asking you to stay, permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want. Not because the house needs running, though it does, and not because the children need a mother, though they do. Because I have watched you every day for 2 months, and I have not once seen you be anything other than exactly what you are. And that is not something I have seen in a person before." He stopped. He did not add to it. He looked at her across the table and waited, and the kettle ticked as it cooled, and the fire settled in the stove, and the night held its cold outside the windows. She did not answer immediately. She sat with it the way he had given her room to sit with it, turning the cup in her hands, and he did not move or speak, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who who have learned to be in the same room without filling it unnecessarily. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket in December, and the snow on the mercantile steps, and the porch step replaced without comment, and the ledger balanced, and the stew on the stove, and Will's voice, saying it smells like when Mom was here, and Ruth at the bread table with flour on her hands, and the recipe tin on the shelf that had been in every kitchen she had ever worked in, and had never been in a kitchen that was hers. "Yes," she said. She looked up at him. "That's what I want." He did not smile broadly. The corner of his mouth moved once and returned, and his eyes were steady and warm, and he nodded as though something had been confirmed that he had been careful not to assume. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way you set your hand on something you are grateful for, and then he took it back. "I'll speak to Reverend Cole in the morning," he said. "All right," she said. They sat a while longer with their cups, not talking, and the fire worked in the stove, and it was enough. They were married on a Saturday in late February in the Harlan's Crossing Church, in a ceremony that was plain and brief and attended by the Greer children, and a small number of neighbors who had quietly revised their opinions since the winter market, which is the way opinion revision works in a small town, without announcement or apology, simply a gradual behavioral change that amounts to the same thing. Ruth stood beside Clara with the particular composure of a girl who has decided to be glad about something, and is being glad about it privately. Henry stood beside his father and was serious about it for approximately 4 minutes, before he noticed a beetle on the window ledge. The twins held hands and watched everything with the round-eyed attention of children, for whom the world is still primarily a spectacle. Gerald Pratt did not attend. He had, in the weeks following the winter market, found it advisable to settle a small, outstanding discrepancy in the Voss land transfer, a clerical matter that Clara's attorney in the county seat, engaged on her behalf by Thomas, had identified in the original mortgage documents. The 40 acres reverted to Clara Voss, now Clara Greer, as part of a quiet legal correction that Pratt did not contest, because contesting it would have required him to explain the discrepancy in public, which he was not willing to do. He did not apologize. That was as close to an apology as Gerald Pratt was going to give, and Clara understood this, and found she did not need more than that. Doris Hale attended the wedding and wore her good hat and said afterward that she had always thought it would work out, which was the closest Doris Hale was going to come to anything either. And the town accepted this revision of history with the practical tolerance of people who have to live in the same place for a long time and have learned to let certain things pass without examination. By the time the frost settled in for the last time that winter and the first thaw came in March, the Greer house on Sutter Creek had a different quality to it, the way a house does when it has found its proper arrangement after a period of not quite having it. The porch step held firm. The kitchen accounts were accurate to the penny. The bread was made on alternating mornings by Clara and Ruth together, and sometimes by Ruth alone, because Clara had shown her everything she knew, and Ruth had taken it and made it her own, which was what Clara had intended. The recipe tin stayed on the kitchen shelf where she had set it on the first morning. It had been there through the Wichita home and the Voss cabin, and now it was here. And she did not think about it much anymore, the way you stop thinking about a thing that has finally arrived where it belongs. One evening in early April, she opened it to find a new card tucked in the back, written in Ruth's careful hand, a recipe for the molasses bread that Ruth had worked out herself over the winter, adjusted from Clara's version, with 2 small changes that were, Clara had to admit when she tried it, improvements. She did not say anything about it to Ruth. Ruth did not say anything about it to her. Nothing needed to be said. Thomas came in from the workshop one afternoon in April to find Clara at the kitchen table with the tin open and the cards spread out, and he stood in the doorway with sawdust on his shirt and looked at her. And she looked up, and he said, "What are you doing?" Adding to it, she said. He looked at the cards and at her and at the kitchen that was warm and organized and smelled like the bread that was in the oven. And something moved across his face that he did not set aside this time. Good, he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the back of the stove, the pot she always left there, and he sat down across from her and watched her write. And the afternoon light came through the kitchen window the way spring light does, pale and new, and not quite ready to be trusted but arriving anyway. And the creek ran under the ice that was breaking up. And the pines on the ridge held their color against a sky that was beginning, slowly, to remember blue. Bess came in from outside with mud on her boots and a question about a bird she had seen. And Will came in behind her with more mud and no question but a strong desire to be where everyone else was. And Henry came down the stairs at a velocity that suggested he had been told not to run on the stairs. And Ruth came in, last from the garden with her hands dirty and her hair loose, and a look on her face that was, unmistakably, the look of a girl who is, on the whole, all right. Thomas looked at Clara across the table, over the spread cards and the coffee cup and the ordinary clutter of a house that is lived in. And Clara looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said or done, or set quietly in its place. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not any more. The 40 acres lay along the south fence, and the water rights ran clear. And the porch step held, and the recipe tin on the shelf was getting full. And that was the story of Clara and Thomas Greer, a woman who arrived at a stranger's door in the snow with a trunk and a broken sewing basket and a tin box of recipes, and found, in the plainest possible way, that she had come home. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.